Good morning, everyone. All information contained herein is provided solely for educational purposes. It is not intended as a substitute for professional or legal advice. Should you decide to act upon any information contained in this presentation, you do so at your own risk. While the information posted has been verified to the best of our abilities, we cannot guarantee that there are no mistakes or errors. This is the Enviroschool program at the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. Today we are presenting the World of Waste Part 1. I'm Tamika Priolo, coordinator for Enviroschool, and I will be moderating today. We will be muting everyone except for the speakers. However, just as a precaution, go ahead and keep yourself muted individually as well. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A option only and not the chat. Type in your questions and we will answer the ones pertaining to the topics discussed at the end of the presentation. Slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on the Enviroschool website and the LDEQ YouTube page. There will be a poll at the end of this webinar to provide your feedback so we can improve our session. So please complete before logging off. Any comments, questions, concerns, any other topics you are interested in seeing, or maybe if there's one you want to dive into a little bit more that was discussed today, feel free to email me at enviroschool@la.gov. We have 4 speakers today in this order: Martin Perilou, Stanley Hazard, Daniel Cheatham, and Mike Hahn. Martin Perilou is the manager of the Waste Permits Engineering Group. He graduated in 2011 with a BS in Civil Engineering from Louisiana Tech University and received his PE license in Environmental Engineering in 2018. He has been working at LDEQ in the Waste Permits Division since 2011. His work involves managing and reviewing solid and hazardous waste permit applications and modifications, cell construction certification, and other facility construction. Our next speaker is Stanley Hazard. He is a Michigan native who moved to Louisiana after an 18-year career in the U.S. Army. He has a bachelor's degree in physical geography from LSU Baton Rouge. His career at LDEQ began in 2007. He has 14 years of experience in regulation development, solid waste permit application review, and financial assurance review. He was recently promoted to environmental scientist staff in the Waste Permits Division. Our next speaker is Daniel Cheatham. He is a Baton Rouge native that graduated from LSU in 2005 and has worked for LDEQ since June 2006. From 2006 through November 2019, he worked in the Office of Environmental Compliance, conducting mainly hazard and solid waste compliance inspections. In December 2019, he moved to the Office of Environmental Services as a hazardous waste permit writer. He is currently the hazardous waste environmental scientist supervisor for the Waste Permits Division. Our last speaker is Michael Hahn. Mike graduated from LSU with a Bachelor's of Science degree in geology. Mike has been with LDEQ in various capacities since 1989. Mike is currently a senior environmental scientist within the Waste Permits Division. So Marty, since you are first up, we will go ahead and begin with you.
Thank you, Tamika. So the first part of this presentation is kind of an introduction to solid waste and what we regulate and what we kind of do at DEQ as far as solid waste goes. And before we even get into that, you kind of ask yourself, what is solid waste? So solid waste is any garbage, refuse, sludge, waste treatment plant, water supply treatment plant, air pollution control from an air pollution control facility, other discarded materials. And solid waste can kind of be liquid, solid, gaseous contained materials. Basically, it's anything that's kind of discarded. Now, this is our regulations. This is our definition from our regulations. I left out the tail end of things that are kind of excluded from the regulation. And so those are things that are not considered solid waste, even though they may be discarded. So yeah, that's solid waste. So here's kind of our generation rates in the country. Came from the EPA website. Americans generated about 2.62 million tons of trash in 2015, which is their latest data. They stopped collecting some of this data. And as you can see over time, the amount of waste generation per person is actually leveled off and somewhat decreased. Whereas our tonnages per year have pretty much steadily risen. By 2015, which is the end of this data set, the average person produced about 4.5 pounds per person per day. So that seems like a lot. That's, everybody produces 4.5 pounds, almost 5 pounds a day. So here's kind of a pie chart of what is solid waste, your general waste that you throw away. And you can see most of the waste is paper and food, yard trimmings, and plastics. And so you can see that we throw a lot of waste away that could be recycled, and we waste a lot of food, which is unfortunate in this country. And then there's plastics, which could, are also recyclable, and then about 13% yard trash, and then you can see the others there. Recycling in Louisiana. So we recycle about, in 2017, 8% of the waste that's generated gets recycled. And that's really for MSW. That does include industrial facilities and stuff what they recycle. Waste reduction varied by parish, and some parishes recycled almost 50%, and some parishes didn't recycle at all. Louisiana, we recycled 217,000 tons in 2017, and we landfilled 2.7 million tons in 2017. So you can see, yeah, we're not doing too good on recycling. And I put this slide to bottom this in red that reuse is better than recycling. So, we didn't take into account reuse of something, but if you can reuse something, that's better than recycling because it takes less resources to reuse something. So here's kind of a breakdown of what we do recycle in Louisiana. So when we do recycle, a large part of it is composting from food scraps and wood waste. And I would imagine most of that's wood waste. So folks are composting wood waste into, soil amendments. You can also shred and chip those wood waste into a flower bed material for mulch. Tires is a large majority of our wood waste, and then of our waste that we recycle. And then there's that 15% other that is various things that don't make up any large majority of stuff. So here's kind of how we were compared to the EU. What we said earlier, 7%, 8% is what we recycle in Louisiana. The EU on average recycles 32% of their waste, and some of the big guys in the EU recycle almost to 50 to 60%. So they're doing a lot better on recycling than we do. So as far as when you do dispose of something, here's the types of facilities that we generally permit and regulate. And so we have landfills, and under those we have municipal landfills that take your household garbage, industrial landfills that take industrial waste. And then we have a kind of a third category of demolition and construction, which take waste only from, the repair, remodeling of structures. And we also regulate surface impoundments, which are basically large ponds that take some type of solid waste and treat, dispose, or discharge waters. And we have landforms, which are facilities that take organic matter and they're tilled into the soil for biological degradation. And then we regulate processors. We have different types of processors, but one of our more common ones we regulate is transfer stations. So ones that take waste and remove them. So As far as disposal facilities, here's what we have in the state. Type 1 industrial landfills. So that's our industrial landfills. We have 21 landfills that only accept industrial waste. We have 25 municipal facilities, and municipal facilities can accept industrial waste if it's in their permit, and the requirements that we put on them are very similar to industrial facilities. But we have about 25 of those. And then those demolished construction landfills, we have 39 of those facilities. And all these facilities are kind of scattered throughout the state, and we'll see that in a later map of the facilities. And we have 236 permits. And so basically anything that's not one of these landfills or processors, surface impoundments, land farms, those are all in that 236. Here's a map of our MSW landfills. They're kind of randomly spread throughout the state, and with kind of a concentration near populated areas. You can see there's all 25 of them. We have one that wasn't constructed. Let's see. Here's our C&D landfills. So you can see they're kind of in the same areas to some degree, concentrated around populated areas. There's a bunch kind of Vernon and Rapides Parish. That's because there's a lot of demoing that goes on in Fort Polk. And you can see a few in Lake Charles, like 9 of them. So yeah, we have a high concentration in some areas with these. So type 1-2 landfills, what are they? So we kind of put those landfills together since they're the same requirements in our regs, except for a few things. So type 1-2 landfills, they take your municipal, your industrial waste. You can see here's a picture of a landfill liner, what's consisted of, and you can see plastic down. And when we design landfills at the department, this is what we're thinking of. So this is what we envision a landfill looks like. They're required to cover every day with soils. They, if they're in municipal, industrial landfills don't cover every day, depending upon the waste they take. If the waste is not, putrescible, which is, smelly, I guess you'd say, is an easy way to say it. So here's kind of what most people think of landfills when they see a movie. They see the compactor running and garbage everywhere. And so, yeah, this is true, but there's a lot going on underneath the waste that you don't see. Typically, these landfills that we require them to accept only non-hazardous. They don't accept liquids. So you can see here, there's a lot of liquids in this landfill in this picture. That's not necessarily good. They have a permit with us with an operational plan that details everything on how they're going to operate, how the waste comes into the facility, how they tip the waste out of the trucks, to the requirements of how they're going to cover this waste and prevent constituents getting to the environment. Also, before they even get to that operational plan or submit us a permit, they have to go and do geology borings that show that this is a good site for this landfill. So if you have a facility that has a lot of sands or potential for groundwater contamination, we generally don't consider those sites when we're doing the permitting process. So one big issue with these types of landfills are odors. We get probably most of our complaints in the solid waste section is about odors. And odors can vary by age and composition of waste. The best thing to find an odor or detect an odor is having a really good inspector. So an inspector can walk through a landfill, one that has a lot of experience, can tell by the way a landfill smells by which type of odors where to find them. So the fresh garbage coming into a facility, it generally has a certain smell, whereas like aged waste, in an older portion of landfill has a much different characteristic to it. Many of these smells or odors are like the 1% other in your landfill gas stream, but they're the most noxious to a person. And so a lot of our uh, equipment that we use to monitor odors is not as sensitive as a person's nose. Um, a lot of times we get calls early in the morning or at night about landfills. And it seems to be people think that something nefarious is going on, and that could be the case, but most of the time it's not. The atmospheric conditions at night, you have low wind a lot of times because you don't have the sun up pushing wind around, and you might see even inversions. So you have certain atmospheric stability conditions that make odors within the vicinity of a landfill much greater at night or in low wind conditions than you do typically during the day. So once a landfill, specifically municipal landfills, are ones that produce a lot of gas, reach a certain size, they're required to install an active gas collecting system. And so what that is basically once a facility reaches 2.5 million megagrams or a bunch of other requirements that are in our air regulations, they have to go through the capital landfill and install gas collection wells. In this picture right here, you'll see this is the top of a gas collection well that goes through the capital landfill into the waste, and gas is pulled through a vacuum through this pipe and into either a flare, or they try to use the gas for something that's useful. The landfill gas typically has a low BTU content, around 550, whereas natural gas is somewhere in the 1,000 range. So we do have some facilities that purify this gas to high BTU standards and sell it in a pipeline. These gas collection systems, they reduce odors. They're good for global warming. A lot of methane is produced at landfills. That's the primary constituent that landfills produce. And so that has a high global warming index. And when you capture this gas, and even if you burn it into CO2, that's better than having it released to the atmosphere. So yeah, the gas is being collected on top of the landfill, and that's preventing constituents getting in the environment. And so at the bottom of the landfill, we have liners. And so those are, their main purpose is to prevent groundwater contamination. So this is our first line of defense at making sure we have good drinking water. So a liner is basically plastic material that covers the landfill that is low perm. And we use a belt and suspender system, basically, is that we have a clay liner and we recompact clay just like you would see in a normal pond or how people build a house pad or something, clay. And then on top of that, the plastic liner. And they really work well together. The clay and the plastic both can have a high flow rate through them, but when they're used together in conjunction, they even if you have a leak in a plastic liner, the clay is below it to limit that flow. So here's kind of a picture right here of why we need liners and how geology works and plays an effect, and how we can monitor whether a liner system is effective. And so here you have a pond that's leaking, and you can see it gets to a groundwater section. And our geologists determine which way groundwater is flowing by a series of wells. And when they monitor the depth in those wells, they can see the gradient and which way the water flows. So they sample these wells and look for constituents that would be indicative of the waste, and that's how they determine whether a liner system's healthy or not. So we went over municipal landfills. Here's C and D landfills. And so what's kind of unique about them is we don't say what you can't put in them. So generally, if RCRA says if it's got to be solid, solid non-hazardous waste, and they lay out what that is. This, we're saying you can only put these certain things in there, and it's basically things that are generating repair, remodeling, demolition, construction, renovation of structures. And we list out if it's not integral to the structure, you can't put it in this landfill. So here's kind of a reason why we permit these. You're putting waste in them that's generally not water soluble, not as, bad for the environment as, municipal or industrial. And so we put less stringent liner requirements on them. They have to have natural low perm soils. They generally don't produce very much gas. And I guess on the flip side, the cost of disposal of these facilities is much lower. Many parishes have their own landfills that dispose of just C&D waste. And those parishes do a lot of wood waste and, their own governmental buildings and stuff they dispose of. So here's another type of unit we regulate, transfer stations. And basically we have two different types, processing and non-processing. And basically with these facilities, it depends upon how far your parish is from a landfill. And they basically, a lot of these facilities do a lot of cost analysis on whether they need a transfer station or not. And basically garbage trucks will roll in these facilities and tip into a larger truck and compact in a larger truck. So instead of having your basic garbage truck on the road going to a landfill, they will tip into a larger truck and only take one truck to a landfill instead of many. So yeah, here's what I just said. Basically, a lot more, I guess, financial savvy people than I decide whether it's worth it or not to have a transfer station and where to put them. But basically, it's all about cost and basically direct haul versus to a landfill versus hauling to one of these transfer stations and using another truck to haul there. That's all I got for basically the basics of solid waste that we have. I'm going to turn it over to Stan Hazard and let him discuss financial assurance.
Thanks, Marty. Enter. Okay, as you can see by my slide title, I've underlined basics, and this is going to be very basic. My initial training in financial assurance was 4 days long. We don't got time for that. So here we go. Permitted facilities have to have financial assurance for closure and post-closure. The world runs on money, and it's no different in the world of waste management. You got to have money to be able to close these facilities and manage the post-closure period. The financial assurance has to be equal to or greater than the total of those cost estimates, with one possible exception, trust funds. And I'll mention a little bit about those later. The requirements for financial assurance are in Chapter 13 of the Solid Waste Regulations. Then there's an appendix, Section 1399, that has the example wording for all the instruments. Those regulations are available online. There's also a few links online dealing with financial assurance too. Okay, these are the instrument types. The trust fund, and then there's a subcategory of that called the standby trust fund. I have a slide that explains the differences between those later. From one of the previous slides there, I mentioned that a trust fund does not have to match the amount of the closure and post-closure cost estimates. That's because you're allowed to, the regulations allow you to pay into a trust fund over time. For landfills, that time period can be up to 20 years. And for other facilities, it can be up to the term of the permit, which is usually 10 years. So you have to do a little math calculation to figure out how much you have to pay in each year to make sure that you're at full funding by the end of the pay-in period. The other instrument types are all ones that provide for full funding. Let's see. The financial test and the local government test can also have guarantees associated with them. For the financial test, that's a corporate guarantee provided by the parent corporation of the company that holds the permit. It's basically a document that says that that parent company will guarantee that the closure and post-closure is paid for. For the local government guarantee, that it isn't used very often, but if a local government, parish government is contracted with a company to run their facility, they can provide a guarantee saying that they will pay for the closure and post-closure. Okay, all of the instruments in that previous slides can be mixed with the exception of the performance bond. That's because the performance bond guarantees that the closure and post-closure activity will be performed, not necessarily paid for. When these regulations were written decades ago, they thought that it would be best that this type of instrument isn't mixed with others. Okay, I said I'd talk about the difference between the trust and the standby trust. A standby trust is required in the case of the two bond types and a letter of credit. The reason for it is because if you go to the bank with a letter of credit and say, hey, I need to draw on this letter of credit, they're not going to give you the cash and let you walk out with it. It has to go into some type of an account. And that's the purpose of the standby trust. Anyway, a trust holds money and a standby trust does not until it's actually used for that purpose. A trust can be a standalone instrument. A standby trust can't be standalone, but it has to accompany one of the bonds or letter of credit, as I previously said. And then the last difference is on the schedules of the trust agreement. A trust will state how much money is in the fund, whereas a standby trust will just say that it's unfunded. And that is it. That is about as basic as I can get. If you have any questions, please write down my contact info and you can send them to me later or ask them at the end of the presentation. And now I'm going to hand it over to Daniel Cheatham.
Thank you, Stan. All right, I want to talk about two different types of subjects. First, we want to go over universal waste management, and I was asked to talk mostly about commercial offices and light industrial. And then the next part will be transfer and transporters for different types of waste. So what are universal waste? They are common everyday items that would meet the definition of hazardous waste. Instead of being regulated as a hazardous waste under our hazardous waste regs, they're regulated under Chapter 38 as a universal waste. And as long as you operate under Chapter 38, the material is not managed as a hazardous waste itself. And it's also not a municipal solid waste. The following waste streams may be managed as universal waste: batteries, mercury-containing equipment, mercury-containing lamps, electronics, antifreeze, pesticides. Another one coming down the pipeline, EPA has adopted a universal waste rule for aerosol cans. LDEQ has not at this time. Universal waste in offices. They're common. Usually you'll find them in batteries as lithium-ion batteries or alkalines, fluorescent lights, in your electronics, your computers, copiers, cell phones, potentially LEDs. So in general, universal waste must be stored in a proper container. Batteries have to be stored in a container that holds the batteries and contain any leakage or spillage or damage that can cause leakage. Fluorescent lamps must be stored in closed containers that are adequate to prevent breakage. Electronic waste must be stored inside or in a trailer in a manner that prevents the electronics from being exposed to the environment and ensures material may be reused, recycled, or any component of the devices can be reused or recycled. Typically, most facilities you'll find that in a closet or a warehouse on a pallet. Universal waste have a very specific labeling requirement. It has to, for example, I have batteries, lamps, and electronics. They have to be labeled as one of these thing. So batteries must be labeled universal waste batteries, used batteries or waste batteries. Lamps must be labeled as universal waste lamps, used lamps or waste lamps. Electronics, universal waste electronics, used electronics or waste electronics. From a compliance standpoint, a lot of facilities will accidentally write like universal waste bulbs, and that's technically a compliance issue. So you have a couple type of generators. You have small quantity handlers of universal waste. They can't store more than 5,000 kilograms of universal waste at any one time. They cannot dispose, treat, or dilute universal waste unless it's in response to a spill or release. They can send their universal waste to another small quantity handler, to a large quantity handler, or to a universal waste destination facility. They are not required to notify LDEQ or EPA of their universal waste activity, so there's no notification requirement. Large quantity handlers, however, they must notify LDEQ when they intend to store more than 5,000 kilograms of universal waste at any one time. They can store universal waste for up to 1 year, or may store universal waste for more than 1 year if it's solely necessary to facilitate proper recovery, treatment, or disposal. They may not dispose, treat, or dilute universal waste unless responding to a release or spill. And they may send universal waste to other SQH facilities, LQH facilities, and destination facilities. Both LQHs and SQHs must inform their employees who handle or have responsibility for managing universal waste and train them. The information must describe proper handling and emergency procedure appropriate to the type of universal waste handled at the facility. SQHs are not required to maintain records of universal waste shipments. They are required to only send universal waste to other handlers, destination facilities, or foreign destinations. Prior to shipping the material, they should receive an agreement from the destination facility that they can take the material. Small quantity handlers who transport their own universal waste to another facility must follow the universal waste transporter requirements, which is Chapter 30, Subchapter D. And we'll get into universal waste transporter stuff in the next part. Large quantity handlers must keep a record of each shipment of universal waste received at the facility or sent from the facility, and have to maintain those records for 3 years. They are required to only send universal waste to other handlers, destination facilities, or foreign destinations. Prior to shipping, the destination facility must agree to take the material and can take the material. And again, LQHs who transport their own universal waste to another facility must follow the transport requirements of Chapter 30, Subchapter D. Just some general notes for universal waste. Most generators of universal waste are small quantity handlers and are not required to notify or maintain records. That's anyone who stores less than 5,000 kilograms at any one time. You must store universal waste in proper containers with the required labeling. Write down the oldest date, the date of the oldest universal waste stored on site, and have that material shipped off site to a destination facility within 1 year. Universal waste personnel must be trained to prevent, Universal waste personnel training will help prevent most common compliance issues. And that's typically labeling and proper storage, and also storing for too long. And universal waste are regulated by Chapter 38 and provide an alternative set of management standards in lieu of the full hazardous waste requirements. All right, and second part, waste transport and transfer. So this is just a general overview. So we have solid waste with transporters, collection facilities, and non-processing transfer facilities. Hazardous waste, we have transporters, transfer facilities less than 10 days, and transfer facilities greater than 10 days. Those are typically hazardous waste storage facilities, and those require a permit. Universal waste, you have transporters, transfer facilities less than 10 days, and transfer facilities greater than 10 days. And then used oil, transporters, transfer facilities less than 35 days, and transfer facilities greater than 35 days. So solid waste transporters, they must submit a solid waste notification within 30 days of becoming subject to the solid waste regulations. Transportation vehicles must meet DOT and DOTD requirements and comply with applicable local ordinances for solid waste pickup. The bodies of vehicles used to transport trees, tree limbs, construction material, or metals shall contain all the waste without allowing the material to fall or blow off the vehicle. That means the vehicle needs to be covered and nothing should fall off. Vehicles used to collect or transport all other solid waste shall be covered at all times except during loading and unloading, because no one likes trash blowing behind a compactor or anything on the road. Vehicles used for the transportation of ash shall be leak resistant and covered as to prevent emissions. Vehicles used to transport solid waste that produces leachate, such as municipal solid waste, your household trash, should contain all liquids generated by the waste. So if you see a garbage truck leaking, that's technically a compliance issue as well. The interior and exterior of the body of the vehicle is used to transport putrescible, which is waste that can become pretty odorous, shall be washed down to minimize odors. Transporters are required to transport waste only to facilities that are permitted to manage and dispose of the waste. Sorry, there's some typos there. So solid waste collection facilities, they must have a notification within 30 days of becoming subject to the solid waste regulations. They must comply with existing zoning and comprehensive land use regulations and ordinances. All waste should be stored in containers to minimize litter discharges, odor, and other pollution of adjoining areas, and properly manage to keep out water, prevent leakage, and empty before the storage of the waste becomes a nuisance, health hazard, or environmental hazard. Collection facilities should not adversely affect traffic or otherwise constitute hazards or endanger public safety. Inspections of collection facilities shall be made at least weekly by the owner and operator, looking for cleanliness of the site, overfill containers, closed lids, leaking containers, and deterioration of containers. Inspections shall be documented and records shall be maintained for a period of 2 years and available upon request within 24 hours. No processing, disposal of solid waste shall occur at the collection facility. Removal of all remaining waste to a permanent facility shall occur at closure of the collection facility. Solid waste non-processing transfer facility. Again, they must submit a solid waste notification within 30 days of becoming subject to the regulations. They must provide advanced written notice at least 30 days prior to construction to the parish governing authority the intent to operate a non-processing transfer station or other type of facility for the offloading and or transloading of solid waste destined for disposal. They must comply with existing zoning and comprehensive land use regulations. They must maintain good access roads or waterways in a manner that shall meet the demands of the facility, is designed to avoid, to the most extent practical, congestion and sharp turns, obstructions, or other hazards conducive to accidents. And they have to meet a required buffer zone. If the material is putrescible, it needs to be at least 200 feet, unless it's near a church and it's 300 feet. Otherwise, it's a 50-foot buffer zone. Solid waste non-processing transfer facilities, non-processing transfer stations may not conduct processing or disposal of solid waste except for separating non-putrescible strikeable materials from commercial solid waste. And that includes paper, wood, glass, plastics, metal, and other materials that have been approved by the department. The recovered material can't be stored on site for more than 30 days. Non-processing transfer stations that separate non-putrescible commercial recyclable materials must submit an annual recycling report to the Office of Environmental Services. The facility shall also comply with container and transporter requirements. Facilities should have control measures to prevent unauthorized entrance or exit with except by willful entry. All gates should be man monitored or locked, and when the facility is closed, they need to be locked. If a tipping area is constructed, the area should be constructed and operated to prevent litter from leaving the tipping area and prevent soil and groundwater contamination. The facility should be inspected at the end of each operating day and documented. All litter and waste shall be cleaned up and placed into the last transportation vehicle. Odor should be minimized. The transfer station shall be cleaned daily to minimize odors and nuisance conditions. All facility records shall be maintained and available for inspection within 24 hours of request. These records, the owner operator of a non-processing transfer station may construct a drop-off area at the non-processing transfer station site, such that certain activities can be conducted. No industrial waste shall be accepted. These areas are intended for the use of commercial facilities and residential solid waste. Collection and storage of the following waste are allowed, which include white goods and pre-sorted yard trash and household recycled materials. Discharges from the facility shall be controlled and shall conform to all state and federal laws, which means if they have a discharge, they may be required to get a water permit. All waste shall be removed to a permitted facility at closure. Notification of closure shall be submitted to Office of Environmental Services. So that's solid waste. Universal waste, hazardous waste, and used oil are all under the hazardous waste regulations. So we're going to start with hazardous waste transporters. Hazardous waste transporters must notify on HW1 and obtain an EPA ID number prior to shipping hazardous waste. They must properly complete all sections of the hazardous waste manifest and maintain copies of the manifest for a period of 3 years. Hazardous waste transporters are required to maintain continuous coverage of $300,000 per vehicle for public liability, $200,000 per vehicle for damage. They must maintain a spill contingency plan, similar to a contingency plan required by an LQG, a large quantity generator. Institute a personal training plan for employees who may manage hazardous waste. So typically if there's a spill or what could happen if there's a wreck. Transporters must clean up any hazardous waste discharge that occurs during transportation. The waste generated from the cleanup, the transporter becomes a generator, and they are required to follow Chapter 10, and they are liable for the material. A container may be used for a shipment of hazardous waste only to the extent permitted under the regulations provided by Department of Public Safety. And they can only be used once. When consolidating the contents of 2 or more containers with the same hazardous waste into a new container, or when combining and consolidating 2 different hazardous wastes that are compatible with each other, the transporter shall mark the containers of 119 gallons or less with the following words: hazardous waste and the appropriate waste codes. So hazardous waste less than 10-day transfer facilities are regulated very similar to a transporter. A transporter stores manifest shipments of hazardous waste in containers at a transfer facility for a period of 10 days or less. They're not subject to majority of the hazardous waste regs, mainly LQG, SQG, and transporter requirements. In respect to the storage of waste, they are required to submit an HW1 and notify that department. And just one quick note, there is no mechanism to extend the storage at a less than 10-day transfer facility. If you go past 10 days, you're required to get a permit. And there's a fee to become a less than 10-day transfer facility, and that's $1,900 due with the application. So transporters to store hazardous waste for more than 10 days are subject to the full hazardous waste requirements with respect to the storage of the waste, and they are required to get a hazardous waste permit. And with the permit, they can store hazardous waste for up to a year. All right. Universal waste transporters. Universal waste transporters are prohibited from disposing of universal waste and prohibited from diluting or treating universal waste, except by responding to releases. They are not required to be shipped on a hazardous waste manifest. A universal waste transporter must immediately contain all releases of universal waste and residues from the universal waste. It must determine whether any material resulting from the release is hazardous waste. Doing proper waste determination in Chapter 10, and then managed under 10 and 11 if it is hazardous waste. A universal waste transport is prohibited from transporting the universal waste to a place other than a universal waste handler, destination facility, or foreign destination. Universal waste transporters may store universal waste at a universal waste transfer facility for less than 10 days. If they need to store for more than 10 days, the material must be stored at a small quantity handler or a large quantity handler, and really depending on the volume of the universal waste being stored. Used oil transporters. Used oil transporters must deliver all used oil received to another transporter, a used oil processing facility, an on-specification used oil burning facility, or an off-specification used oil burning facility. Transporters must be able to demonstrate that the used oil that they're transporting contains less than 1,000 ppm halogens. That's important because if it has less than 1,000 ppm halogens, it's the used oil is presumed to be not hazardous. Transporters must comply with all DOT regulations. If used oil is discharged or released, the release must be contained and cleaned to prevent hazard or danger to human health or the environment, and the National Response Center must be notified and a written report submitted. Used oil transfer facilities are any transportation related facility, including loading docks, parking areas, storage areas, or other areas where shipments of used oil are held for more than 24 hours, and but not longer than 35 days during the normal course of transportation. Transfer facilities that hold used oil for more than 35 days must register as a used oil processor and refiner. Used oil may only be stored in containers, tanks, or other permitted storage units. Used oil, fill pipes, and underground storage tanks must be labeled used oil. If there's a spill, used oil transfer facilities must respond to the spill immediately. They must stop the release, contain the release material, clean up and properly manage the release material and all associated cleanup materials, and repair and replace any leaking or damaged equipment. Residues generated from the storage and transfer of used oil must be managed under Chapter 4003E. Used oil transporters must transport used oil on a manifest, must keep a record for at least 3 years. Manifest must include the name and address of the generator, transporter, or processor who provide the oil, the EPA identification number of who provide the oil, quantity of oil accepted, date of acceptance, signature and date of the representative who generated, transported, or processor who provide the oil. And similarly, used oil transporters must keep a record of all used oil shipments delivered for the previous 3 years. And it has to include the name and the address of the facility receiving the oil, EPID number of the who received the oil, quantity of oil delivered, date of oil delivered, signature and date of the representative for the receiving facility. However, that's not required for a rail shipment. One other thing I want to add, used oil transfer facilities also had a fee for the application. And if I remember correctly, it's $1,400. And that is everything for me. I'm going to turn this over to Mike Hahn.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to be talking about LDEQ's adoption of recent federal hazardous waste regulations. So basically the regulations you see in the Code of Federal Regulations, eventually for hazardous waste, they have to make their way to our regulations. So we're going to talk about the delegation of the hazardous waste program. We're going to talk about effective dates and the list of recent hazardous waste regulations that were finalized by EPA and those that we're in the process are considering to adopt. And then lastly, we'll talk about the hazardous waste generator improvements rule. Before I start, I want to talk about the delegation of the hazardous waste program, just so that everybody understands why DEQ, we actually promulgate hazardous waste regulations. You know, basically under RCRA Subtitle C, the hazardous waste program is designed to be administered by the states instead of EPA. So the state hazardous waste programs must be authorized. That is, they must be approved by EPA. And of course, EPA has oversight and enforcement of authorized state hazardous waste programs. There are certain portions of the hazardous waste programs that EPA will not delegate to the states. Examples include importing and exporting of hazardous waste, and also no migration petitions, you know, the exemptions to allow land disposal of hazardous waste by deep well injection. Louisiana, we are an authorized state, so we operate our hazardous waste program in lieu of EPA. EPA administers the hazardous waste program in Alaska, Iowa, Puerto Rico, and some of the territories. States with an authorized hazardous waste program, such as Louisiana, we must have regulations that are equivalent to and no less stringent than EPA's regulations. They can be more stringent than EPA's regulations. In general, our regulations are not. There are a few minor, more stringent requirements. They can be broader in scope than EPA's regulations. That is, they can be enforced by the state, but they're not part of the state's authorized program, and they cannot be enforced by EPA. And I'm going to talk about that more later on. But in this example, you know, we have a fee system, and so those fees are not part of our authorized program. We must maintain the program by adopting any new federal hazardous waste regulations. We must have adequate enforcement authority. We have to be able to provide for public participation and availability of info. And we must be consistent with the federal program and other state hazardous waste programs. The federal hazardous waste regulations are promulgated by EPA using a public participation process. They're published in the Federal Register, and they're codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. The federal rules, when you see them in the Federal Register, they are accompanied by a preamble. That is, there's an introduction, and it'll put the rule in context, and it'll talk about certain guidance and so forth. Many states adopt the federal regulations by incorporation by reference. That is, they just reference the citation to those federal regulations, and basically the same language that the federal regulations become the state's regulations. Whereas DEQ, for the most part, we actually rewrite the hazardous waste regulations. It takes a whole lot longer to do that, but it's an opportunity for clarifications, and it allows for additional input and actually codifying guidance, and that guidance could be in the preamble. So Louisiana's hazardous waste regulations are promulgated by DEQ using a public participation process, and you'll find them published in the Louisiana Register, which is on the Division of Administration website, and they're codified in the Louisiana Administrative Code, and they are available through DEQ's website. Most states are now authorized, but must maintain their authorization for new federal regs. And they can also, of course, initiate their own rules. EPA must review those rules and make sure, you know, that they're consistent with the hazardous waste regulations, and then also, and with RCRA, and then also they become public noticed. And so EPA Region 6 is our reviewer. And so once they are reviewed, EPA Region 6, they will public notice them in the Federal Register notice. The Federal Register notice outlines the federal rules for which a state can now be authorized. And so basically it'll explain in the Federal Register notice what we're authorized for and not authorized for. And so if you go to 40 CFR 272 subpart T, that's where you will find the state of Louisiana. There are two main federal laws that created the hazardous waste program, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act of 1976, and then HISWA, the Hazardous Waste and Solid Waste Amendments. These two laws in general dictate under which, dictates how EPA promulgates a hazardous waste regulation. And so it determines when the regulation will go into effect. RCRA-derived rules take effect in an authorized state only after the state adopts them, whereas a HISWA-derived rule takes effect immediately, regardless of whether the state has authority to enforce the rule or not. Some EPA rules contain provisions that are promulgated under both RCRA and HISWA, and then the federal rule preamble, it'll discuss the effective dates. So these are the recent hazardous waste regulations finalized by EPA that we're going to be talking about. Conditional exclusion for carbon dioxide streams and geologic sequestration activities. This was a final rule published by EPA in January of 2014. We're going to talk about 3 importing and exporting hazardous waste rules. One being the hazardous waste export-import revisions. There's another one that confidentiality determinations for hazardous waste export and import documents. And then there's a third rule, the conforming changes to Canada-specific hazardous waste import, export, recovery, and disposal operation codes. Then we're going to talk about the user fees for the electronic hazardous waste manifest system and amendments to the manifest regulations. We're going to briefly talk about the safe management of recalled airbags, the management standards for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and amendment to the P075 listing for nicotine, increasing recycling, adding aerosol cans to the universal waste regulations. That was the universal waste rule that Daniel alluded to, and we're going to talk about that one. Modernizing ignitable liquids determination. That's a very recent rule that came out by EPA. And then we're going to talk about the generator improvement rule. So the conditional exclusion for carbon dioxide streams and geologic sequestration activities. The background of it, of course, is that geologic sequestration is the injection of CO2 into deep subsurface rock formations for permanent isolation. Geologic sequestration is the key component of carbon capture and storage, which is a climate change mitigation technology. This rule needed to remove uncertainty of CO2 streams under RCRA Subtitle C. For the most part, CO2 would not be considered a hazardous waste. This rule was kind of more an abundance of caution. There was some question about the regulatory status of it. So EPA went ahead and adopted this rule. It's a conditional exclusion from the hazardous waste definition for CO2, provided that the CO2 waste streams are captured from an emission source, and then also that the CO2 waste streams have to be injected into an underground injection control class 6 well for geologic sequestration. No mixture of any other hazardous waste is allowed. It requires compliance with the federal DOTD transportation requirements, and also pipeline safety regulation requirements that are promulgated both by the U.S. Department of Transportation and also the state's Department of Natural Resources. It also requires compliance with Class 6 underground injection control requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. This is a new class of deep well injection, which DNR, Department of Natural Resources, is in the process of requesting authorization. It requires a certification statement for both the generator of the CO2 and also the operator of the deep well, the owner operator of the deep well. This is an optional rule. We are in the process of adopting it, but it's not effective until we do. but it's in the final stages of adoption, and we expect it to go final at the end of this year. The hazardous waste export import revisions rule. Basically 90% of our imports and exports of hazardous waste are with Canada or Mexico. Prior to this rule, the regulations had less stringent controls for hazardous waste imported and exported to and from Canada and Mexico compared to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries. The controls for the OECD countries are widely accepted as the international standard for control of transboundary waste shipments. So EPA went ahead and amended the regulations for consistency, so that now hazardous waste imported and exported from Canada and Mexico are basically the same for all the countries. And it also allows electronic validation of exports and electronic submittal of import-export related documents. So this rule is already effective in all the states and territories. Basically importing and exporting, it's a function of the federal government as a matter of foreign policy. So we really have no control of it. We do have to adopt the rule though, just so that we maintain our equivalency with the federal program. We anticipate adopting this rule and the other two other import-export rules, incorporating by reference at the end of next year. The next rule about importing and exporting is the confidentiality determinations for hazardous waste export and import documents. Basically, this will prohibit the assertion of confidential business information, CBI claims for documents related to the export or import, and also the transit of hazardous waste and export of excluded CRTs, cathode ray tubes. Again, this rule is already effective in all states and territories since this is a foreign policy matter. State programs, again, we're required to adopt it, and along with the other two hazardous waste import-export rules, will be done so hopefully by the end of next year. The last import-export hazardous waste rule is the conforming changes to Canada's specific hazardous waste import-export recovery and disposal operation codes. The purpose of this rule, basically Canada changed some of the codes relating to the operations and the waste codes regarding importing and exporting of hazardous waste. So this will match the Canada's changes that they made. This rule is already effective in all the states. We're required to adopt it, and we anticipate adopting it with all of the two other rules in the next year. And just FYI, these are all the different waste codes that were affected by that rule change with Canada. The next rule is the user fees for the electronic hazardous waste manifest system and amendments to the manifest regulation. Basically, there was an act of Congress that established the requirement for a national electronic manifest system back in 2016. EPA went ahead and had to promulgate regulations, which were done back in 2016 and 2014, and were adopted by DEQ in 2016. So this rule will establish the methodology for the user fees submitted to EPA. These user fees they won't go to us, it's to EPA for the e-manifest system. And so basically it'll talk about which users are subject to the fees, the transactions that are required, the formula for the fees, and the payment options, and those sorts of things. And of course, the manifest system, that you see the little pictogram down there, it's a cradle to grave. So any manifesting of hazardous waste, would be subject, potentially subject to those user fees. There's also some non-fee related issues that are incorporated in this rule. Every now and then EPA will slip in some non-related issues in another rule. And this is one of those cases. It will allow certain changes for the routing of manifested waste while in transit. It allows generators, transporters, and receiving facilities to make electronic corrections to previously submitted manifest data. And it will allow for a hybrid approach to the manifest, that is to use both paper and electronic manifesting. Most of the parts of this rule are not delegable to the states. Again, this is a national program. So all of the provisions except one are effective already in all the states and territories. That one exception being the in-transit changes for transporters. That will only be effective when a DEQ adopts the rule. And of course, we do have to adopt the rule to maintain our equivalency with the federal program. We are looking to adopt this rule possibly when it might be the same rule package as with the importing, exporting hazardous waste rules that we adopt next year. And the reason being is that when you go and look at our regulations, the importing and exporting rule and the manifesting information, that's all in Chapter 11 of our hazardous waste regulations. So it might make sense to go ahead and adopt it then. The next rule is the safe management of recalled airbags. This was a result of the 2015 recall of Takata airbag inflators. It's a conditional exemption from the hazardous waste requirements for the dealerships and the auto repair shops that are removing the airbag modules and inflators. It's similar to the universal waste rule. Entities are considered airbag waste handlers and not hazardous waste generators. There's a maximum accumulation of 250 parts and a maximum accumulation of 180 days. The parts being shipped off site must comply with hazmat shipping rules and marked with the words airbag waste, do not reuse. And the parts must be shipped to a facility under a vehicle manufacturer's control or otherwise arranged pursuant to a recall or to a permitted hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility. This is an optional rule that is less stringent than previous federal rules. Currently, DEQ has decided not to move forward with the adoption of this rule. We may change that in the next few months, but right now we are not moving forward with that rule. And so it will not be effective in Louisiana unless we adopt that. The management standards for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, an amendment to the P075 listing for nicotine. This is a new regulation under subpart P for the management of hazardous waste pharmaceutical by healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. It's a cost-saving, streamlined standards for managing hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to better fit with the operations of the healthcare sector. There is a prohibition on sewering, that is pouring down the drain of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals for all generators. This portion is effective in all states, and it was effective August of 2019. The other parts are effective after DEQ adopts this rule. For the very small quantity generators, everything is optional except for the sewering prohibition and the empty container standards that we're going to talk about. There's some new definitions associated with this rule. It defines healthcare facility. It includes hospitals, surgical centers, medical offices, and then also pharmacies. There's a definition for long-term care facilities, basically, hospices and nursing facilities, but it does not include group homes or living facilities. There's a new definition for pharmaceuticals. That is, it's a drug or dietary supplement, whether it be prescription or over the counter for use by humans or animals. It includes electronic nicotine delivery systems, the e-cigarette or vaping pen, liquid nicotine, pre-filled cartridges or vials. There's a new definition for the hazardous waste pharmaceutical. It's a pharmaceutical that is a solid waste as defined in the hazardous waste regulations. exhibiting one or more characteristic, or it's listed in the hazardous waste regulations. There's a new definition for what's called potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical. These are prescription hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that have a reasonable expectation to be sent back to the recovery distributor, the reverse distributor, for manufacturing credit, and is in original manufacturing packaging. It's been undispensed and it's less than a year past its expiration. And then there's a new definition for non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical. These are prescription hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that do not have a reasonable expectation to be eligible for the manufacturer credit. So basically, they shouldn't be sent back to the reverse distributors. They have the non-prescription hazardous waste pharmaceuticals not having a reasonable expectation to be legitimately used or reused or reclaimed. So examples, the free samples, items that are past a year in expiration date, floor sweepings, items removed from their packaging, etc. And then there's a definition for evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceutical. These are prescription hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that have been sent to the reverse distributor and determined that they are not eligible for the manufacturer credit. And then there's a definition for household pharmaceutical waste. Just as you might imagine, similar to the household hazardous waste, household hazardous materials exclusion. Basically, a pharmaceutical that is a solid waste is defined by the hazardous waste regulations, but it's excluded from being a hazardous waste. Again, it's from an individual residence, hotel, or crew quarter. There's a definition for the reverse distributor. These are the facilities that are receiving back the prescription pharmaceuticals for the purposes of the verifying the manufacturer credit. And then there's a definition for reverse logistics center. These are the facilities that evaluate unsold retail items, including non-prescription pharmaceuticals, the over-the-counter medicines. And the reverse logistics centers, would analyze for secondary markets to see if there's any use or reuse for those materials. Non-prescription pharmaceuticals sent through the reverse logistics are not waste at the healthcare or retail facility if there is a reasonable expectation of being lawfully used or reused for their intended purpose or reclaimed. So the requirements for the healthcare facility, once we promulgate this rule, and if a healthcare facility falls under the requirements of this rule, they will need to notify DEQ using the hazardous waste notification form. There's a certain amount of training that will be required. The training similar to what's required for a small quantity generator. Basically, the personnel managing the non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals would need to be familiar with the proper waste handling and emergency procedures. The healthcare facilities will be required to do hazardous waste determinations to determine whether a waste pharmaceutical is in fact a hazardous waste pharmaceutical. The exception would be if a healthcare facility decides just to go ahead and manage all of their waste pharmaceuticals as a hazardous waste, in which case they would not need to do a hazardous waste determination. There are accumulation standards for the non-creditable pharmaceutical waste. Basically, the container labeling and accumulation time requirements, and then other requirements such as the land disposal restrictions, record keeping, and reporting. So let's talk a little bit about the potentially creditable versus the non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, they can be sent back to the reverse distributors, but they must be less than 1 year expired and in their original packaging. There's no shipping, no manifesting required. They just need to follow the DOTD shipping requirements and training requirements. Certain training requirements would apply. The non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals cannot be sent back to the reverse distributor. There are labeling and storage and shipping requirements, basically, like a hazardous waste. It's okay to ship to a treatment, storage, or disposal facility. Reverse distributors are required to notify EPA, I guess, and it would be DEQ actually, of any non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that they received. And then there are shipping, the manifesting requirements. So now we're going to talk about the amendment to the P075 listing for nicotine. Basically, what that amendment does is to remove the over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies, the patches, the lozenges, and gums from the P075 acute listing for nicotine. Basically, there's just not enough nicotine in those patches and gums and lozenges that they would be considered acute waste. But there would be a continuing to regulate the e-liquids and the e-juices in the e-cigarettes, the cartridges and the vials, the prescription nicotine, the legacy pesticides that contain nicotine, and then nicotine used in research and manufacturing. This is a less stringent and optional amendment, but DEQ will probably go ahead and adopt it. To me, it only makes sense to do that. Then there's a conditional exemption for controlled substances that are regulated by the Drug Enforcement Administration. Basically, those drugs that are regulated by DEA as a controlled substances would not be regulated as a hazardous waste pharmaceutical if they are in fact, done under the DEA. The rule defines what RCRA empty is for containers. Basically, a container is any stock and dispensing bottle, vial, or ampule and unit dose containers. A unit dose container being a packet, a cup, a wrapper, a blister pack. Basically, a container would be considered RCRA empty if all the contents are removed by normal means. I think that's an important phrase to remember. So basically, if you use up the contents as you were supposed to, then they would not be the containers would be considered empty. This applies to drug containers up to 10,000 tabs or 1 liter if a liquid. For syringes, they would be considered RCRA empty when the contents have been removed by fully depressing the plunger and administered for their intended purposes. IV bags would be considered empty when the contents were fully administered. RCRA empty would not apply to aerosols, tubes, gels, creams, ointments, and nebulizers. So the prohibition of sewering, it is effective in all the states and territories. This was back in 2019. The removal of the nicotine patches, gums, and lozenges from the P075 listing is considered to be less stringent and optional for DEQ to adopt. So it's not effective until we adopt it, which we think we're going to adopt it. The other parts of the rule are considered more stringent and must be adopted by DEQ, but they are not effective until we do adopt them. I think we will probably have this rule adopted by the end of next year or the beginning of 2023. Best guess. The next rule that we're going to talk about is the increasing recycling, adding aerosol cans to the universal waste regulations. Basically, this adds the hazardous waste aerosol cans to the universal waste program. Daniel Cheatham talked about the universal waste program before. This will just add aerosol cans, which it defines as non-refillable receptacle containing a gas compressed, liquefied, or dissolved under pressure, the sole purpose of which is to expel a liquid, paste, or powder, and fitted with a self-closing release device, allowing the contents to be ejected by the gas. And if you ever wonder what an aerosol can is, that's what it is. Basically, the universal waste management standards will apply. This includes the labeling, the time limits, the training, et cetera, that Daniel Cheatham talked about previously. There are specific standards for the puncturing and draining of the aerosol cans. Basically, it will need to be done by a commercial device designed to safely puncture aerosol cans and effectively contain the residual contents and emissions from the puncturing and draining activities. There will need to be written procedures for the puncturing and draining and for the spill and releases. There need to be some training, any residuals from the puncturing transferred to a tank or container. You'll need to do a hazardous waste determination on the residuals. There will need to be a standby spill cleanup kit. And then any spills or leaks will need to be promptly cleaned up. The rule will require the recycling of the emptied can. This is consistent with how EPA has previously exempted aerosol can management in the past. Basically, the recycling exemption, that if the metal is being recycled, then EPA has kind of viewed that the management of the aerosol cans, it's viewed as exempt. So this kind of just codifies that thought process. This is a less stringent optional rule that we do intend to adopt, but it's not effective until we do. We're hoping to adopt this rule by the end of next year or the beginning of 2023. The modernizing ignitable liquids determination. Basically, as the name suggests, this modernizes how the ignitable characteristic for hazardous waste is determined. It allows for modern equipment and techniques, and especially for the non-mercury thermometers. There will be no change to the characteristic itself. Basically, it's still the potential for a direct or indirect fire hazard or a liquids with flash points less than 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And EPA does not anticipate any changing of the analytical results themselves. The rule will codify guidance previously issued by EPA regarding what's considered aqueous, that is 50% water by weight. It does not codify other guidance regarding aqueous alcohol exclusion and sampling of multiple phase waste. However, these guidances are discussed further in the preamble of the rule. So this is one of those cases where when we adopt this rule, we'll probably look at the preamble to see maybe if we can actually codify that guidance. This might be one of those opportunities where us rewriting the rule is actually beneficial. So this rule is neither more nor less stringent, and thus it's optional. So it's not effective until we do adopt it. And we're looking at hopefully adopting this at the end of next year or the beginning of 2023. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the generator improvements rule, which we've already adopted, and it's already effective as of July 20th of last year. We adopted all parts of the rule. During the public comment period for the rule, there were some minor comments that were submitted regarding corrections and clarifications. So we are working on a small separate cleanup rule package for this rule. The goals of the generator improvement rule, basically the idea, the key word being improvement, was to reorganize the regulations to make them more user-friendly, to allow some more flexibility in the management of hazardous waste, to address certain gaps in the regulations, to define terms that we might use but were not in the regulation or in the regulation. One of those terms that's not in the regulation, wasn't previously in the regulation, was satellite accumulation area, which I was surprised, but that term was never used before. And then other clarifications and revisions. So when you go to chapter 10 of our hazardous waste regulations, that's where you will find a nice, concise chapter for the requirements for the generator of hazardous waste. So the improvement in consolidating the hazardous waste generator requirements, I think it accomplished that. It better organizes the requirements into distinct sections for very small quantity generators, small quantity generators, and large quantity generators. Most of the requirements are self-contained, and there's less reference to other parts of the regulations. In the past, you might have had to go to the interim status regulations, which referred you back to the permitting standards. So now a lot less of that back and forth stuff. And just note that Chapter 11 still is in there, and Chapter 11 of our regulations contains the manifesting, importing, and exporting. And that's, of course, where we'll be adopting the regulations for the importing and exporting of hazardous waste, and then also the a user fee for the e-manifesting system. So the generator improvement rule, it clarifies, hazardous waste determinations. Basically, when you determine if a solid waste is a listed or characteristic hazardous waste, it basically clarifies how you have to make that determination. It emphasizes that the determination has to be accurate, that it has to be done at the point of origin before dilution, mixing, or other alteration. And then also that the determination has to be redone whenever there, the properties of that waste stream change, or the classification may change. And then SQGs and LQGs, the small quantity generators and large quantity generators, must put the RCRA waste codes on their containers prior to shipping them for treatment, storage, or disposal. And then there's some a little more record keeping involved. There's clarification regarding the generator category determination. The three categories of a hazardous waste generator: the very small quantity generator, the small quantity generator, and the large quantity generator. Previously, the regulations used the term conditionally exempt small quantity generator. That term has been replaced with very small quantity generator. So it clarifies the process for determining those three categories, and it has to be done for the calendar month. It clarifies, the acute waste and the non-acute hazardous waste, how that fits into those determinations. And then it also clarifies the impact of mixing hazardous waste with non-hazardous waste. So as I mentioned before, the term satellite accumulation area was not previously in the regulations. That the concept was the requirements for a satellite accumulation were, but now that term is used. Basically, a satellite accumulation area, it's hazardous waste that's stored at or near the point of generation and under the control of the operator. You're storing up to 55 gallons or 1 quart of acute hazardous waste. So the revisions and clarifications as part of this rule, basically it prohibits the mixing of incompatible hazardous waste. It limits when you can have a container of hazardous waste opened at a satellite accumulation area. It clarifies the amount that can be accumulated for acute hazardous waste. And then it clarifies that the container must be removed within 3 consecutive calendar days once the container is full. It prohibits the accumulation of reactive hazardous waste at a satellite accumulation area. And then the marking and labeling requirements are consistent with the central accumulation area requirements. And then there must be, the satellite accumulation area must be included in emergency preparedness. So some of the requirements for very small quantity generators, again, the very small quantity generator, the term, it replaces conditionally exempt small quantity generator. It's the same requirements as previously in the old regulations, but there are some flexibility how they can manage the hazardous waste. So they can do the consolidation to a sister facility and that's a large quantity generator under the control of the same person. So if you had a corporation and they had multiple facilities, one of those facilities is a large quantity generator. Well, the very small quantity generator can send their hazardous waste to that sister facility. The very small quantity generator would just need to label the container as hazardous waste and list the hazards associated with it. And then they would just ship those containers using DOTD requirements. They would not need to be manifested or sent through a hazardous waste transporter. The LQG, the sister facility, would just need to notify DEQ that they are going to be receiving the VSQIG waste. They would need to manage the VSQIG hazardous waste appropriately, incorporating the VSQIG waste into their hazardous waste management program. There would be, just need to be some record keeping, and then they would need to include the VSQIG waste in their annual reporting. So the other thing for VSQIG and flexibility in how they manage their hazardous waste is episodic generation. And this applies to the small quantity generators as well. Basically, whenever a VSQIG and a small quantity generator generate hazardous waste, they have to stay within their category normally. Well, the rule allows a VSQIG and a small quantity generator to exceed their allowance for one planned event and one unplanned event a year. Well, actually it's one event, but they can petition for a second event, and they must petition it to the DEQ. So basically, if a VSQIG or an SQG exceed, anticipate, well, if it's an unplanned event, they would just need like an upset or spill, or a planned event for a tank clean out. There would be a notification requirement. For the planned event, it would be a prior notification. And for the unplanned event, it would be a subsequent notification. So the SQGs, they would need to comply with the SQG regulations and maintain records, just as they would be doing previously, as an SQG. So basically no additional requirements. And then the very small quantity generators, they would have some more requirements. They would have to have an ID number. Of course, in Louisiana, that's a more stringent requirement that we have, that all very small quantity generators have to have an ID number. But they need to have an ID number. They would have to use a manifest, hazardous waste manifest, and use a hazardous waste transporter to ship their hazardous waste, and then other requirements. Some of the marking and labeling requirements for all for the large quantity and small quantity generators. The labeling would have to be done at the point of generation and includes the satellite accumulation areas, the central accumulation areas, and transfer facilities. The labels must indicate the hazards. So basically they could use one of the different, the various methods, the Department of Transportation, the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration requirements, NFPA, or RCRA requirements. The containers must be marked or barcoded with the RCRA waste codes prior to being shipped to a treatment storage disposal facility. Some of the changes regarding emergency preparedness and planning. The arrangements with the local emergency responders must be documented, even the attempts that are made for those arrangements. There's more flexibility in the record keeping. Facilities with internal capabilities may seek a waiver. And then the local emergency planning committees are okay. There is a requirement for in the contingency planning for a quick reference guide. Basically, this is for any new or updated contingency plans. Basically, it's a 1-2 page document that it's to help the local emergency responders in the event of an emergency. And it incorporates Executive Order 13650 on improving the chemical facility safety and security. There's 8 elements to the quick reference guide, basically what the hazardous wastes are, the amounts. There needs to be a map, a contact of the emergency coordinators, etc. Some of the other clarifications and areas of flexibility in the emergency planning, preparedness and planning. It emphasizes that it applies only to hazardous waste, and it's for the points of generation, the satellite accumulation areas and central accumulation areas. It can, you can eliminate now the personal information that used to be in the contingency plans. A lot of home phone numbers used to have to have been in the contingency plans. Those don't need to be there now. It clarifies what immediate access is as direct or unimpeded access. The SQGs and LQGs can determine the most appropriate locations for the emergency equipment. SQGs can use a contractor to address any releases. And then relevant emergency response info for a small quantity generator should be posted next to the phone. There's a waiver now that you can seek from the 50-foot buffer requirement for containers holding ignitable or reactive waste. You know, if you're in a strip mall, you're a dry cleaner and you're in a strip mall, it's hard to meet that buffer requirement. So basically you can go to the fire marshal, you know, if you have mitigating circumstances, you know, a reinforced wall or something like that, you can go to the fire marshal and get a waiver. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the closure notification requirements. The closure notification, the closure performance standards for a large quantity generator have always been there. Basically, the closure performance standards are, you know, once a large quantity generator ceases operations, you know, they have to close the units, to their LQG units, the central accumulation areas, to be protective of human health and the environment. That includes, you know, removing and decontaminating any remaining hazardous waste residuals, and then proper managing of any hazardous waste generated from the closure. And then if you couldn't meet the closure performance standard, you had to close as a landfill. Those closure performance standards have always been there. Now there is a requirement for the LQGs to notify DEQ when they intend to close a facility. The notification, it's optional when a LQG closes a central accumulation area, but when they close the facility, it's required. So the optional notification, basically, if they close the central accumulation area, they can choose to just close it as it like the facility, and they would need to notify DEQ no later than 30 days prior to closing the facility. This will be done on the HW1 form, and then you would notify DEQ within 90 days after closing the facility. And you would state on the HW1 form whether you met the closure performance standard or not. And then you can get an extension if an extension is needed. And then the rule emphasizes that this does not apply to satellite accumulation areas. There are some clarifications unique to DEQ. They are broader in scope than the federal rule. They're consistent with the federal rule. These were based upon discussions with the internal DEQ personnel and then also external stakeholders. The reason we did these clarifications, you know, the closure notification program, if you will, is such a unique thing, a new thing to DEQ, that we wanted to make sure everybody knew what the requirements were and what the expectations were. So the clarifications that are unique to DEQ, basically it requires, it spells out what the information would need to be in the operating record for an individual unit. You know, you would need to say why you were closing that unit, the name of the unit or some sort of description, the location of the unit, what the hazardous wastes were. These things weren't in the federal rule. It's something that we think is important. It specifically allows for the use of recap for risk in closures. It allows for closures with contaminations from other sources. We wanted to make sure that, if there was contamination from another source, that did not affect the closure of these individual units or facility. That would be dealt with under another program at DEQ. It allows the LQG to request a sufficiency demonstration for various changes in their closure notification. They still have to meet the closure performance standard, but if there's certain documents or submittals or certain deconning procedures and sampling that they think is not required or need to change, then we can consider that. And it allows for the use of guidance. DEQ in the process of developing a guidance document. And then it grandfathered in the closures that were initiated prior to the effective date of the rule, but that effective date, I think, has since passed. For containers, basically for containers, if you remove the container, whether it be a container that has long-term and fixed secondary containment or not, if you remove the container, basically you met the closure performance standard. That's what we call a presumptive demonstration of closure. It does not require any kind of deconning or confirmatory sampling. And again, we're talking just about container storage. And so basically we would receive the HW1 notification, the supporting documents would be kept on the site by the LQG. And an inspector goes out, we would look at those documents. For closures of tank systems, containment buildings, and drip pads, we do require additional information. They are a different thing, not like a container. We require basically prior notification to say how you're going to be doing the deconning and confirmatory sampling for those units. We specify that the recap screening standards are the numerical closure performance standards. And we actually require a report to be submitted to DEQ for review and approval. And this is some information in case you needed additional information on the state authorization program, how we are authorized by DEQ from EPA. That's the website for state authorization information. That's the link to the rules and regulations for DEQ's website. And then also the link to the Division of Administration's Louisiana Register, which is again where the rules are officially published. And there's my contact information.